Welcome back to our show, Prison Debt Solutions. Hello, I'm your host, Cuie, and I'm pleased that you've rejoined us for another enlightening half hour. Now, in case you weren't with us for our last show, let me just take a moment to share with you the purpose of Prison Debt Solutions. Now, the show is designed to contribute towards the national conversation on criminal justice reform. And we believe the show will generate legal and policy discussions which hopefully serve advocates and policymakers throughout the country and the very diverse stakeholders in criminal justice to help chart concrete reforms. Prison Debt Solutions will not only discuss the issues around the criminalization of prison debt, but we'll have our guests on our show who are experiencing the struggle and trying to pay such debts in order to avoid sanctions up to and including jail time. Subsequent to an appearing on our show, ex-felons and their families will be connected with both legal and financial counseling. The results of their saga shall be aired at a later date to share with the viewing audience the outcomes of having the requisite resources available to ensure the effective application of case law to prevent incarceration resulting from non-payment of this immoral and illegal assessment of debt. Now, for those of you who are with us during our last show, you'll recall that our show revolves around legal financial obligations, or LFOs as they're called in the criminal justice system. LFOs defined are fines, fees, miscellaneous charges, surcharges, court costs, restitution, and bail. I also explained the history of LFOs from the days of debtors' prisons back in the 1700s, when the United States had a change of federal laws in 1833 outlawing the same, leaving such matters to the state's jurisdictions. Fast forwarded to 1983, when the practices of debtors' prisons was ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional in Bearden v. Georgia. Now, this was a landmark case that held that a local government can only imprison or jail someone for not paying a fine if it can be shown by means of a hearing that the person in question could have paid it but willfully chose not to do so, or simply stated, a person demonstrated that they did not possess the ability to pay. Now, the Supreme Court summed things up that such practices, which amounted to debtors' prisons, which was and remains as one of the denial of human rights. We also discussed the hard dollar cost that offenders have to incur. In the United States, more than $50 billion in criminal justice debt is owed, and that's designed to cover costs unmet by states' general funds paid for by taxpayers. The states had an enormous explosion in prison populations, and the cost to run such a massive bureaucracy is enormous. In fact, in 2013, almost a dozen states spent more on corrections than they did on higher education. That's a shame. I also noted that only in 44 states, civil judges can issue arrest warrants for debtors. And ironically, the overwhelming number of arrests for non-payment of LFOs is a violation of an individual's constitutional rights. However, most people are unaware of this Supreme Court decision. And even if such a defense is mounted by a defendant, the judges are choosing to ignore the proper application of constitutional law. And finally, by way of review, I shared with you, our audience, the negative post-release impacts of LFOs. They are the increased cost to taxpayers because of the tracking and implementation systems required to administer these wrong-headed policies. It should also be noted that these monetary sanctions jeopardize the community safety because forcing law enforcement officials like sheriffs and probation and parole officers to monitor individuals who have failed to pay a fee diverts scarce resources of an already overburdened system to collect debt. And for the ex-offender, outstanding criminal justice debt can impede access to housing, employment, and public benefits, making it difficult for people to reintegrate into society. And the likelihood of increases in recidivism occurs since the outstanding debt, combined with unemployment, may encourage an individual towards further criminal activity when they fail to make the payments, and that can result in them being reincarcerated. And don't forget that charging fees to these ex-offenders diverts money from food and rent health care for their children, and hinders a person's ability to make child support payments. Then finally, there is such an exceptionally poor return on taxpayer investment for policies surrounding LFOs. The challenge is to administer these policies nationally has a collection rate of approximately 25%. Reform of LFOs is part of the overall efforts nationally that are focused on criminal justice reform, but it's a major part. However, it doesn't get the airtime of other elements such as recidivism and employment, parenting, etc. It's very strange since LFOs are such a major threat to the successful reentry of ex-offenders. In my opinion, it's due in large part to being such an embarrassment to courts and a cash cow to state governments who milk it for all it's worth. However, let's take a look at criminal justice reform as a whole. Over the last 30 years, the United States has become to rely on its criminal justice system and lengthy prison terms more than any other nation. With just 5% of the world's population, the U.S. holds nearly a quarter of the world's prisoners, including 1/3 of all women incarcerated worldwide. Over-reliance on prison is fiscally unsustainable and has imposed a burden, a human toll, and a desperate impact on African American and Latino persons and communities. It's difficult to accept that the U.S. is the world's leader in incarceration. There are 2.2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails, and that's a 500% increase over the last 40 years, 500%. Changes in law and policy, not changes in crime rates, explain most of this increase. The results are overcrowding in prisons and fiscal burdens on states, despite increasing evidence that large-scale incarceration is not an effective means of achieving public safety. How did this happen? Well, a series of law enforcement and sentencing policy changes out of the tough-on-crime era resulted in dramatic growth in incarceration. Since the official beginning of the war on drugs, like in 1982, the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses in the U.S. skyrocketed from 40,000 in 1980 to 450,000 in 2016. Today, there are more people behind bars for drug offense than the number of people who were in prison or jail for any crime in 1980. The good news is that attention has been paid to a number of policy-driven areas highlighted by incidents going back some 48 years, almost half a century. In 1971, for instance, at Attica Correctional Facility in New York, Attica inmates took 38 prison guards hostage. 4 days later, 39 people were dead, including correctional officers, civil employees, and prisoners. Now, this served as a catalyst for future work on prison reform, which was led by the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington. Now, we look at the Second Chance Act of 2007, which was submitted by Congressman Danny Davis to reauthorize and rewrite and expand provisions for adult and juvenile offenders, state and local reentry demonstration projects. And that was done in order to expand services to offenders and their families for reentry into society. Key provisions of this bill were to promote the safe and successful reintegration of offenders into the community upon their release by providing employment services, substance abuse treatment, housing, family programming, and trying to provide mentoring services to adult and juvenile offenders. And also, it has some family-based treatment programs for incarcerated parents who have minor children. The Second Chance Act of 2007 received bipartisan support from 218 Democrats and 129 Republicans, thereby enacting the bill into legislation on April 9th of 2008. Then you have the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which was an act of Congress that was signed into federal law by then President Barack Obama on August 3rd of 2010. And that reduced the disparity between the amount of crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentencing needed to trigger federal criminal penalties and eliminated the 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for simple possession of crack cocaine. Supposedly, this disparity existed because it was Congress's point of view that crack cocaine was a more dangerous and harmful drug than powder cocaine. In the decades since, extensive research by the United States Sentencing Commission and other experts has suggested that the differences between the effects of the two drugs are exaggerated and that the sentencing disparity is unwarranted. Bottom line, the sentencing disparity was determined to be racially biased and contributing to a disproportionate number of African Americans being sentenced for crack cocaine offenses. So now let's fast forward to the First Step Act, which reforms the federal prison system and seeks to reduce recidivism. That act was signed by President Donald Trump on December 21st of 2018, before the end of the 115th Congress. The passage of the First Step Act was certainly significant, but that is less because of what it specifically accomplished than because of what it showed. Now, the passage of this act across the ideological spectrum demonstrated that there's a real momentum for more criminal justice reform, including bold ideas that Trump is unlikely to ever support. Progressives would be wise to seize on this momentum and help it grow. This first step was positive, but it shouldn't be the last. In preparation for this episode of Prison Debt Solutions, I was chatting with my wonderful wife, and she asked me whether or not I've considered sharing my personal story, which may provide some context for my involvement in advocacy for the reform of LFOs. And at first I said no, but after giving it about 10 seconds of thought, I concluded that she's correct. So let me take a minute to provide such context regarding my personal commitment to shedding light on the matter of legal financial obligations. I was born in Los Angeles. I was the youngest of 5 kids. Age 11, my family moved to Portland, Oregon, where I became a scholar athlete in high school, and then I received a scholarship to play college football. Later, I was drafted by the Chicago Bears of the NFL, but returned to the university to earn a Bachelor's of Art in Business Administration from Oregon State University. So I began my professional career in healthcare, in the industry of healthcare, with positions in sales and marketing management. I was promoted from the position of trainee in San Francisco, being promoted to sales manager in Minneapolis, then moving up the ladder to region manager in Miami, Florida. There I became a hot commodity of corporate recruiters who managed to convince me to take a position with PepsiCo and relocate to Philadelphia, where I met then Mayor W. Wilson Good Sr., who hired me to serve the city of Philadelphia as Assistant Managing Director. My performance earned me a promotion to Deputy Managing Director, and that was a position which I became, somewhat known as an effective public administrator, let's say. That led me to being appointed as a deputy mayor in the Ed Rendell administration. Leaving government, I became an entrepreneur, and I established a company that specialized in agribusiness trade between the United States, Western, and Southern Africa. In that role, I managed a number of significant firms in a very, very competitive market, very competitive. But then, I ran into financial difficulty, and I became addicted to drugs and alcohol. That led me to commit a very senseless crime for which I was tried and convicted, receiving a sentence of 3 to 6 years. However, given the benefit of treatment, I returned to society and committed my life to finding solutions to the serious challenges that in the lives of ex-offenders facing reintegration. Subsequently, I was appointed on February 21st of 2008 as the Director of the Mayor's Office for Reentry of Ex-Offenders. Then I served as a Special Assistant for Policy and Planning for Reintegration Services in the City of Philadelphia. These days, I remain dedicated to reducing the recidivism of ex-offenders by assisting them when and where I can to successfully transition back into our community as productive, tax-paying citizens. Now, I personally experienced those burdens associated with legal financial obligations hanging over my head prior to and upon release from the Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution in Chester, Pennsylvania. In May of 2008, my family did not have any resources to support me upon my release. The female that I was dating at the time did send me some new clothing so that I did not have to dress like an inmate while on the streets, because I had no other clothes except prison-issued garments. No bank account, no credit, no debit cards, definitely no cash on hand, and nobody owed me any money that I could collect upon. So unbeknownst to me, the clock had been ticking on me for child support payments while I was incarcerated. I wound up going to court and being given 30 days to come up with a couple of thousands of dollars, which I did not have. As things progressed, I received pro bono support from a very prominent defense lawyer in Philadelphia. And he managed to negotiate on my behalf with the courts and my ex to have the outstanding child support waived due to the fact that it had accumulated while I was still incarcerated. This judge was so angry that my ex-wife had agreed to waive the outstanding child support that he literally called me names during the final hearing. That man glared at me with such hatred in his heart that I was stunned. It was all I could do not to show any emotion when he called me a bloodsucker. But I was able to maintain my composure, and I walked out of that court without child support continuing to hang over my head and threaten my freedom. But take a look at this clip.
Our next panel is state and local perspectives, defining the problem and highlighting reform. You'll hear from people who have personally experienced the practices we're discussing today, and from 2 state legislators who've taken significant steps to implement reform. Moderating this panel is Jerry Abramson, Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. Jerry oversees the President's domestic agenda with state, city, county, and tribal elected officials across the country. Prior to coming to the White House, Jerry served in state, city, and county governments in Kentucky. Jerry's the former Lieutenant Governor of Kentucky and is also the longest-serving mayor of Louisville, having served for 21 years. He rightly earned the nickname Mayor for Life. Jerry and panel, would you please come out here and take your seats? Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of this very important subject matter and very important session that I think will lay out, not only give you some specific anecdotes of real-life situations that create the reason why we are here, as well as give you some insight from the legislative point of view, both state senator and state representative, about some of the legislation that has been pending and has been passed to respond to the difficulties that exist. I want to start off first with Mr. Papa, Stephen Papa, who's from the state of Michigan and an Army veteran. And I want to ask you, Mr. Papa, to sort of talk to the group about your experience and how you dealt with the experience. And I think it's important to realize that Mr. Papa was not, and continues not to be a reoccurring offender. But in fact has an interesting experience that I think will give you some background and understanding of how this problem permeates folks around the country. So, Mr. Papa.
All right. I just want to thank you guys for having me here to start off. To start off, I'll just tell you what happened. It was a couple years ago. Me and my brother actually were out having a good time, maybe too good of a time, because I don't remember the rest of the night. Woke up in handcuffs, and I was like, man, this is not where I want to be. I'm hoping this is a dream, and it really wasn't. So what happened is I did the time for it. I did 2.5 weeks, which is, hey, you do the crime, you do the time, right? So afterwards, I got released. The judge said to bring some money to sentencing. So I was like, okay, I didn't have a job at the time, so I did what I could, helping friends and friends' families, just getting whatever I could. Time of sentencing comes around, I show up, and I had $30. That's all I really had, because the rest of the money I had used to make myself be there, through eating and stuff like that. So I get there, he tells me everything, and he goes, he's like, well, you got your $50? I was like, no, sir. I was like, I only have $30, but I can actually have $20 in like 5 minutes. My grandma can be here, I can get $20 in like 5 minutes. He's like, well, I'm sorry, because you'll be in jail already. I was like, well, sir, I just got a job. I'm willing to go over the $40 a month and do $40 a week. I get paid on Friday, and this was a Monday. He's like, well, I'm sorry. And his exact words were, he told me to hustle legally, picking up pop cans and mowing lawns for $200 $2,600 fine. And I just thought that was kind of outrageous. So he ended up putting me in jail for 2.5 weeks for $20. And that I lost a job. I had a decent job working in a factory making $12 an hour. And I lost that, so I didn't have nothing. I ended up being homeless for about a week. And actually, I'm still kind of suffering a little bit now, because my main thing I wanted to do was re-enlist back in the military. And now with the charges that I have, they just won't let me. It's just like my calling. I just want to, go back and serve for the country again. But other than that, yeah, that's pretty much wraps it up. I just want to end by saying thank you guys very much for having me out here and giving me the opportunity to explain this to you guys.
Thank you very much, Mr. Papa. I'm now going to switch to Elvis Mann. Mr. Mann is from Alabama, lived in Alabama all his life. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about his experience with the, am I pronouncing it right, the Chellersburg Police Department, and most specifically his involvement with the private probation company that he had an opportunity or a requirement to engage with. So, Mr. Mann?
First of all, I just want to thank y'all for having me here, and I just want to share a little what happened to me. Back in '82, I lived. My home is in Harpersville, Alabama, and I moved from Harpersville to Chillersburg. But above all this, Harpersville had suspended my license before I moved to Chillersburg. So I went to moved to Chillersburg, and that's when the nightmare began. I got stopped a traffic ticket in Chillersburg, and they gave me a $300 or $400 fine, and I couldn't pay the fine, and they said if you can't pay the fine, you can go talk to the probation, and they'll put you on probation. I said, well, I believe that's gonna be all right. I can have enough time to pay it. So I went and got on that probation, and then that was when all hell broke loose. I'm talking about they hassle me, they start talking to me like I'm a little young child. You don't have the money, you ain't gonna get out, you're going to jail if you don't, they was giving me a hard time. And so I told them that, give me a little time to pay it, but they never would. Then they locked me up in jail. I stayed in jail for about 2 or 3 months, and then I get out. And then when I get out, I had to go back to the probation office, and then when you go in the little office, they lock the doors behind you. Like when I go in there and talk to them about the probation, then they'll lock. You can hear the door locked behind you, and I thought it was kind of funny, And she said, "Oh well, what you got for me today, Miss?" I ain't got no money today. I'm trying to get on top, and me and my wife, my wife ain't able to work, and we struggling, And she I said, well, I tell you what, next time you come in here, you better have some money, or else you going to jail. So, all right, that after I had done got out of jail, and then 2 days after I had got out of jail, and they had to go back to see them. Then I went, and then it went on, and I got sick, and I went to the hospital in Brookwood, and gave my wife. So my wife gave her $50 to go down there and to pay them. While I was in the hospital, I had a real bad staph infection. And they talked to my wife. She came in, she was, she came in there, she was crying, man. And I said, what's wrong? She said, man, baby, you could have heard the way they were talking to me. And they telling me, you ain't, you got to, if he get out the hospital, he got to come here. If he don't when he get out the hospital, he going to jail, and I just don't, I just couldn't handle it. And then, and a friend of mine, he told me, he said, Elvis, I know a way that I know somebody that could probably help you. And I said, man, and, you know, I had doubts about, you know, I was just giving up, you know, because it was just living in another world. And I said, oh, I'll give it a try. He said, well, you call this office. And that's why I called Ms. Alexander's office. And I asked her, and I talked to her, and she said, well, do you know anything about Birmingham? I said, yes, ma'am. I'll find it. She said, well, could you and your wife be over here? I said, yes, ma'am. I said, I can be over there. So I goes over there, and she said, and I tell her my story, what happened to me. She said, well, when you got another court date? And I tell her, and then she said, well, I'll be there. And I still had doubt that she was going to help me because I didn't think nobody was strong at the JCS, you know. I mean, I didn't think nobody was strong enough to stop it, you know, because they were just taking my money, and man, I'm trying, you know, I gave them $600, and they were going to carry me to jail after I gave them the $600, and they still, I had another probation thing that same week, and then they wanted more money. Then after I got in touch, I had got enough, and I went to see my lawyer, and she said, I'll be at court with you. And so she asked me, when the next time will you be in court? And she said, I'll be there. I looked around, but I didn't think she was coming, but she came, she showed up. And when she showed up, I was happy, but then I still had doubt that she can do anything. And then when they called my case, and I went to the front to stand, and they was telling me how much I owe and this and that. And then she said, I'm representing Mr. Mann, Mr. Evans Mann. And she said, well, I don't think that, then when he told her, and then she said, well, I don't think Mr. Mann owe y'all anymore. And this and that. And then her and another guy that got a little dispute, so I stepped back and let her did what she had to do. You know what I mean? I just stepped back and let her did what she had to do. But then when she had, you know, when she had talked to them and got me off, that was a most important day of my whole life. I felt when he dismissed everything. He dismissed he told the judge. He just said, well, you know, your fine is paid. If you wipe it clean, I thank God, Miss Alexander. I thank God for y'all. Thank God for your firm. I thank God for you helping me. Not only for me, I thank God for her helping other people in my neighborhood. They had a lot more people in my neighborhood. A lot of in our community was scared. They get a ticket for walking. You know what I mean? They get it's outrageous. And she got me to set up at my house where she can meet some of the people and talk to some of the people at my house and bring the paperwork that they had gave them and the receipt that they had gave them to my house. And I had about 10 or 15, 20 people at my house. They had my little trailer they packed, and she talked to them and they told her their story the way JC had done them. But now we don't no longer have JCS down there anymore, and I thank God for you.
Thank you.
I need your attention on an important workshop called Prison Debt Solutions. If you, a loved one, or someone you just know and care about is facing debt that they can't pay to the criminal justice system, now go to our website, prisondebt.com, for the time, date, and location. That's prisondebt.com. You don't want to miss this opportunity to take control of your freedom.